One service that extension agents and staff can provide to consumers is testing their dial gauge canners for their pressure canners. And so today I'm going to show you the apparatus that we can use to do that service. This is a pressure gauge tester that we get from Presto. Presto is one of the major manufacturers of pressure canners. And so this is an air pump type apparatus. There's no heat, there's no water involved. This is a piece of equipment that can be used by one person, so you can do this test all by yourself. So there's a few pieces about this that you need to be aware of. It comes in a box, such as this over here. It comes with a bunch of foam. You need to keep that because part of the cost of buying one of these includes a free service agreement to get your gauge tested, and if you're having problems with your air cylinder or any other parts of the testing unit, you can send it back in the original box and with the foam. So you want to keep that. One of the most important parts of this gauge tester is the master gauge, and this comes in its own separate box like this with some foam in it, and it's always a good idea to, when you're storing this, is to store it in that box. This is the air pump cylinder. This is the point where we'll put the lid with the gauge on this so we can measure it. Back here is where we place the master gauge, so it just presses down until it snaps. You want to hear that snapping sound. There are little rubber gaskets here. There's various sizes that are stored in this little black plastic tub, and you can change those out based on the type of canner lid that you're working with or the gauge. There's a hose that connects the air cylinder to the air pump mechanism, which is a foot pump. So that red foot pump sits on the floor, and so that's what you use to pump up the pressure inside the air cylinder. When a consumer comes in with their gauge, they can bring in the gauge by itself, or they can leave it attached to the lid, such as I have here. There are only 4 brands of canners that we can test with this apparatus: National, Presto, Maid of Honor, or Magic Seal. There's another brand of canners, pressure canners out there called All American, which has a dial gauge on it also, but we cannot test those gauges with this pressure tester. So now I'm going to ask my friend Londa to come in and help me run the pressure tester. Now, you can run this by yourself, but today how we have this set up, I'm going to have her run the foot pedal for me while I hold the lid onto the air cylinder. So we have our master gauge set, and now I place the gauge onto the cylinder and hold it at an angle that's similar to what the direction of the air cylinder is, and Londa will pump up. And what we want to do is compare the pressure on the master gauge. Okay, we can stop there. We want to compare the pressure on the master gauge to what the pressure is showing on the consumer's gauge, and we want to get the master gauge to show about 10 pounds. Oh, I lost my pressure. Go back up just a little bit. Just a little bit. Right there. Right there. Okay, we're going to let it go just a little. I can get it to drop right there. So we want to compare the 10 pounds to what this says, and I am just a hair over 9 pounds. So my gauge is reading about 1 pound low. You want to test the gauge at the pressure that the consumer uses most commonly. So if they're canning their products at about 10 pounds of pressure, that's what you should test it at. If they're using 15 pounds of pressure most of the time, test the gauge at 15 pounds. So when you report back to your consumer, you can give them a form. You can inspect the canner entirely itself, help them out by checking the gasket on the inside, make sure it's not cracked or dried out or anything like that, because if it is, then the steam can leak outside of the canner. Check the vent port, make sure it's clean. You want to see light through it when you hold it up to a light. An easy way to clean that is to use a pipe cleaner, and that will clean out any food debris that might be in there. And then just make sure everything else is working. Also check the overpressure plug, make sure it's not cracked and dried out, because that can be replaced. And then report back to them what their gauge is reading versus the master gauge. So this gauge is reading 1 pound low. So if they're using a recipe that says to pressure their product at 11 pounds of pressure, my gauge will need to read at least 10 pounds. That will be equivalent to 11 pounds on the master gauge. So you can give them a form to remind them what that pressure is, and that way they can refer back to that when they're ready to pressure their products. So pressure gauge testing only needs to be done on dial gauge pressure canners. Weighted gauge canners, there's no testing that needs to be done. Consumers could bring them in, and you can check the condition of the canners and the gaskets and make sure that they're still in good condition. Another thing to remember is that at least yearly or maybe every 2 years, send your gauge, your master gauge, and maybe the entire tester back to Presto for your maintenance. That way you're making sure that your equipment is reading properly. And as far as the consumer is concerned, they need to come in every year and get their gauges tested. That way they are ensured that they're making a safe product and they're keeping their canners up to date, in good condition, and they can last a really long time.